Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to Middle Way Mom Reads, where we dig into books to enhance and inform our homeschooling journey. I'm Shannon, a homeschooling mom since 2009, and a student of the Islamic Sciences, working toward my bachelor's degree in Islamic Sciences from Mishka University. I've been using the Charlotte Mason method since 2016, and I'm hoping that this podcast helps more parents realize the value of the Charlotte Mason method in their homes. So we're starting with the most classic book in the Charlotte Mason series called Home Education. It's a 6-volume series. We'll work through the book together, inshallah. I'll discuss highlights of the book without the assumption that you have read it yourself, but of course you would gain more value if you read the book along with me. So today we are picking up with a section about the child should be made familiar with natural objects. It is a short section today. If you are following along, we're on page 69. And she just starts saying, an observant child should be put in the way of things worth observing. So we've talked about in a few of the previous sections about this out of door time, how much time we should be spending outdoors. And I've kind of added in here some of the fruits of that labor that we expect, that we should start to see their habit of observation become a bit more keen, their habit of detail, of noticing the details, and then also having that detail in their vocabulary, uh, being able to describe one tree in comparison to another, or one squirrel in comparison to another, one bird in comparison to another. We need to work on that vocabulary, and that's something that comes naturally when you're trying to tell somebody about something that you've been noticing and observing. So this whole section is about bringing kids in front of things that are worthy of being observed. So often we bring kids into parks where every park looks like the other park, right? Like there's a playground, they all have birch trees or they all have oak trees, and there's just nothing super interesting about one to the other. And granted, this is better than sitting in your living room and never leaving it, and so on and so forth. But there are grades of things worth observing. So that's what she's talking about today. Um, I don't remember if we covered it before, but I know that in this book she does encourage, in another section, to go out into the city. If you're living in her time, she's talking about London. If you're living in the middle of London, to one of the examples that she gives, I don't think that we covered this yet, so spoiler alert, is going to the city and noticing the displays. So there's something to be said about using what is right in front of you and finding the value of what is there. And she's also encouraging parents to get outside of the city and notice the natural world. She says, but the scraps of information to be picked up in a town are isolated fragments. They do not hang on to anything else, nor come to anything more. The information may be convenient, but no one is the wiser for knowing on which side of the street is Smith's and which turning leads to Thompson's shop. Sorry about that. And when I'm thinking about like these displays in the shop window, there's nothing like, if I pay very close attention to this shop window, that teaches me nothing about anything else in life. Whereas when I am observing the natural world, all of these things play into one another. There's like this natural connectedness. We'll notice I'm looking out this window at a very wintry scene, right? This natural connectedness of the shorter days in the winter. And what does that mean for the living world? So of course there's the leaves that drop. We see different birds. There's been a lot of conjecture, I guess, of like, why do birds migrate when they migrate? Is it temperature? Is it like, how do birds know when to come back to Minnesota? And one of the theories is that they're able to observe like the rivers being higher farther south. So then you can see that like the snow is melting farther north is just an example. But we see that one thing is all connected to the others. We have chickens, and so we have noticed in our quails actually right around October, the quails stopped laying eggs. And people always ask, well, is it because it was cold? No, it's not because it was cold. It's because the sun is the length of the day is so short that the birds stop laying eggs. And we had to look up fertility cycles of cats, things that I never knew that I would ever need to know. But they actually go based on the length of days as well. And it makes a lot of sense that when the days are very short, that females are not going to be as fertile when they're wild animals, right? They're not going to give birth to a brand new baby in the middle of February when it's very, very cold. And the length of the day is a very good indicator of how cold it's going to be outside. So also, she gives some examples of like a smooth pebble that you find in the river versus a rough rock that you find on the mountainside. So that naturally leads to talk of erosion. Why is this smooth and why is this one rough? Another one is the rings on a twig versus the rings on a branch or the rings on a trunk. And you'll also notice the rings are different from one year to the next, and that can indicate drought or it can indicate a time of abundance when it comes to rain and sunlight and so on and so forth, where there's more growth or less growth. So we see all of this interconnectedness from one thing to the next when we're put in the way of natural observations. In the next section on page 71, she says, "It is infinitely well worth the mother's while to take some pains every day to secure, in the first place, that her children spend hours daily amongst rural and natural objects, and, in the second place, to infuse into them, or rather to cherish in them, the love of investigation." And she goes on to talk about because the future of our culture, right? The future of humanity is in the hands of scientific men. Again, this was written over 100 years ago, and we see that this came true. That we can't say that it's a prophecy, but like this prediction came true. The hands of our culture are in the or I'm sorry, the power essentially of our culture is in the hands of scientific people. When we say men here, we're using that in the, mankind, general sense. Um, that when we have that habit of observation, which I keep talking about, but it's so valuable. One of the really bad habits of our day is we don't pay attention in the first place. One, we expect that everybody is going to repeat themselves if we didn't listen to them the first time. This is particularly true when it comes to children, that, if you ask them, okay, I need you to get your socks on, get your shoes on, and be ready to walk out the door. And then if you ask them, well, what did I just say? We're leaving. Right? And then they're getting out the door with, sandals on and there's snow on the ground and whatever. Like this being able to pull your whole attention to something. I mean, you can't we would pay millions of dollars if we could guarantee that we could secure this habit in our children. And when you put them in the way of things worth observing, that it inculcates this fairly naturally. She says, "In learning true knowledge, they will have learned also their own ignorance in the vastness, the complexity, the mystery of nature." You see, as people get farther into science, um, atheism tends to be a little bit more common. And then in my observation, you can count me wrong if you need or want or what have you, but there comes a point where we realize how much we don't know. And there's again a reverence for the divine. There's a reverence for this is created. There is a creator. There's this phenomenon that I haven't seen it written about formally, but everybody that I talk to that's in a place of learning, has seen this, and it's essentially this: you up until you know about 5% of something. So let's say, my first degree was in IT. My second degree is in Islamic studies. And so, like, I've seen this in myself twice now, where you learn 5% about something and you're like, I'm on the cusp of being an expert in this thing. Like, I almost know everything. And then you get past that and you realize, I know nothing. I know almost nothing about this, right? Like, you get to the point that you realize actually how much is there. And so you know what you don't know. Or you can at least recognize there's all of this other stuff that I don't know. And until you get to like 95% of knowledge in that subject, you're like, I'm kind of an idiot about this. I kind of know nothing. And then when you get to like 95 to 99%, because you can never get to 100, you're like, I kind of know stuff. So we when we have this true knowledge of our natural world, as we get closer to that 95, and whatever, like, I'm making up these numbers, right? Maybe it's 80%, who knows? Somebody should, do the actual research and come up with something a little bit more solid than what I'm describing, but this this pattern holds true, and I stand firm on this. But when we learn at that very least, like, that 6% where we say, "Wow, there's so much that I don't know." That's where we want our children to be in a place where they have reverence for the natural world, for science and the system that it is, right? Science is our observation of things that happen naturally. That's how science really started, and of course there's like the branch of science where we're inventing things, we're harnessing things, so on and so forth. But really it starts with observation first and foremost. And so if we can at least get our kids to that 6% where they have that reverence for mashallah, when I am seeing the patterns in nature of the migratory patterns in not just birds, but just how this fits into this web of experience of even just this pinpoint of where I live in the world, that inshallah can hold fast to their faith instead of this 1 and 2% knowledge where now they feel like you get this attitude, I don't need God to explain things. Yes, you do. One, you know almost nothing. And that's how you can be so arrogant, is because you're so ignorant. So really this is one of the fruits that we hope for with this knowledge as well, in putting them into touch with things worth observing, like she says. Um, the last section actually is intimacy with nature makes for personal well-being. So again, she's talking about the fruits of this labor. She says, number one, they can follow a scientific conversation and make good decisions. So when, COVID is the perfect example of this. Where are we able to follow a conversation, and where are we just like throwing up our hands and saying, okay, I'm going to pick somebody that I trust and I'm just going to run with whatever they tell me to do. And we can see how that lands, where when people were able to discern information for themselves, one, you tend to get people who are a little bit less extreme about things. Again, that arrogance that people tend to have is generally from a place of ignorance. Not always. Sometimes people are arrogant because they're like, I really am for real an expert on this. I have like 99% knowledge on this. Um, but oftentimes your everyday person, when they're really arrogant about something, it's often that they're pretty ignorant. So they should be able to, inshallah, follow some kind of scientific conversation, just to, maybe they can't contribute to the conversation, but they can follow the conversation. Um, this is a silly example, but I was listening as an audiobook. What was it? It was by Degrassi, yeah, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and it was Astrophysics for People in a Hurry, I think. And there's certain books that I really just have a hard time listening to as an audiobook. This definitely falls into that category, and it was before I realized there's certain audiobooks that it's hard, like, I need to read it, I need to see it with my eyes. Um, and, like, I had a really hard time following along, like, there's just an assumption that I already knew a good amount about physics, and I've never taken physics, I am working on my 2nd bachelor's degree, and I've never taken physics. It's just kind of how my education has worked for me. That's where things have landed. So I'm unable to follow that conversation. So, I mean, they could say, like, "There's a new thing. There's, black holes and purple holes and pink holes." I'd be like, "Oh, okay, sure. Tell me whatever you think." And, I'm working to fix that. But inshallah, we can work toward our kids having some ability to at least listen in and follow along. So number 2, this personal well-being for having this intimacy with the natural world is that they can be interested and not just interesting. And I know that we've talked about this before. I think that it's really important to hone in on this. And this is one of those phrases that I think is mottos, I guess, that's really important as we are raising, especially like the tweens and teens, and they go through this time period or phase in their growing up where often our culture is more focused on being interesting, and it's not cool, I guess. I feel like an old lady saying it's not cool to be interested in things. So the kids who are really interested in birds or chess or Lord of the Rings or whatever, like horses, they're made fun of, right? Like, "Oh my gosh, you're such a geek about this." No, they're interested in things. And you find when you look at people who live a satisfied and fulfilled life, they're interested in things. If you're only focused on being interesting, then it's like you're chasing a moving target. If I'm interesting right now, then when what is interesting to the greater culture changes, either I need to change or I'm no longer interesting. So it's really important that there is a internal locus of control instead of an external locus of control, and that they hold fast to that, and being able to put them in lots of places where interesting things are happening or interesting things are being talked about, then they can be interested in those things. When we're looking at longevity in the elderly, in not just longevity, but quality of life in the elderly, having hobbies, having things that they're digging into and learning about is really key to having a satisfied and fulfilled life, in those later years where the physical aspect is dwindling. Um, it can also help, so this being interesting, can also help them to keep out of trouble, because this curiosity can keep them busy, right? If they're always digging into how do I buy a horse, and how do I ride a horse, and how do I take care of a horse, and how do I, how much space do they need to live, and so on and so forth, then, all of those Google searches that maybe they're doing is filled with that and not filled with all the other things that we could Google that we should not be Googling. So like I said, this section is a little bit shorter. That wraps up this section on being put in the way of things worth observing. The next section is on out of door geography. So things that we're noticing when we're on these on these nature walks, and it can be something small, walking to the library, walking to the post office, those type of things. But we're going to get into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of what that looks like. What does it look like to really hands-on talk about geography? And this isn't like you find a Pinterest activity and you make some kind of folder with flaps and whatever. This is, you go outside and you say, okay, well, we need to go west. Where does where's the sun in the afternoon? And is that east or west, north or south? And how can we figure out where is west from here? And just making this really relevant. You can even talk about, okay, well, we need to go to the library and drop off these books. We want to walk. The library is west of here. So do we want to make that walk in the afternoon, or do we want to make that walk in the morning? We don't want the sun to be in our eyes, in our face. So this can dictate when we want to do these trips, when we dictate how our day functions. So that is for next time, inshallah. We are ending on page 72 for anyone who is following along. As I've stated before, of course, I'm covering quite a bit in the book. We're going quite slow through this, but you will actually gain additional benefit if you purchase the book and read it for yourself. You can find a link to that in the show notes on this podcast or video. If you have any questions, you can contact me at Shannon, that's SHANNEN, at middlewaymom.com. You can find me as Middle Way Mom on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube as well. And I look forward to meeting with you guys again, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.